watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
In 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland, they came very well prepared with a list of most affluent families, Jewish families, and amongst them was our family. And of course, several days passed, a group of Nazis entered our home. They demanded they want to speak to my mother. She spoke fluent German. And they told her, "You've got a very nice home here, but you won't be needing it for very long. We command you, by tomorrow 12 o'clock, you have to deliver all the things which we see here. If not, one of your children going to be shot." Well, of course, my mother said, "Whatever you see here, we will deliver as you command." And off they went. Don't forget, everything was requisitioned. Cars, lorries, everything which was on wheels. So we had rather very difficult task how we're going to get this stuff to the headquarters. My mother was rather very bright. She walked out several kilometers outside the city, and she managed to obtain a horse with a wagon from a farmyard. She came back and we loaded on all our belongings, with the exception of furniture. And we had to go several times backwards and forwards. We had to deliver all our food which we prepared for the time of the war and so on, large quantities. And the last thing, when my mother came back, she was in tears, because whatever she worked for, she saved for, everything was gone. But later months and years, we learned all those possessions had no meaning. The starvation and the torture and the fear was horrendous. A few days later, another group of Nazis entered our home, and they demanded the keys of the business. We had a textile business. And my mother says, "You never mentioned about the keys." "Oh yes, everything what you possess, we want." And so she quickly trod to the sideboard and she produced the keys of the business. And my brother was at home. He was actually a student of dentistry. And as the universities are closed, everything was schools and so on, so he happened to be at home. And they looked at him and they told him, "You're lucky today," which we didn't like very much. That thought, that remark, and off they went. Then we had to assemble outside the headquarters every day, and work was allocated to us, which we weren't accustomed to. We had to unload coal from the trucks, huge lumps of coal, place them in buckets, and 2 buckets on each side of our arms. We had to carry them backwards and forwards. But not just carry them and unload them, but also we were whipped. By the evening when we returned home, we were completely, utterly exhausted. And then all type of work. They treated us in the most sadistic, terrible way. I think animals are treated better than we were. Then they put us in a ghetto. And certain amounts of people were only allowed to enter. So they had to register people. And those people which did not obtain a seal on their identity card So those people had to move out 35 kilometers outside Krakow. And amongst them we did not get it. So in a way we were pleased because we're not so locked in yet. The day came where people entered the ghetto and we had to move out from our homes into this part, Borek, it's outside Krakow. A little room, there was one bed we used as a kitchen, as a washroom, and as a bedroom. My mother and my two sisters, we slept in one bed. And then in the morning we had to go out again on foot to the city, to the factory where we were helping to repair the uniforms, which they came back from the front, my sisters. And the day came when the segregation of the men. So my brother went, and his best friend was also a student of chemistry. And they were very close, and the other one also had this girlfriend and also had the ceremony as well as my brother. And he's been sent away. So following day, his wife came over to my brother. And she says to him, Vile, could you please come and help me to move this wardrobe? Because it's rather very difficult for me to do so. And of course, he felt it's the wife of his best friend, he's got to go and help her. And she happened to live across the road. So he went there, and he stood on a table in order to clear the things from the table. And a shot fired at him. And as bad news travels very fast, they reached us. In the meantime, he's been taken to the hospital. So my mother, my two sisters and myself, we rushed to the hospital. We weren't allowed to enter. We had to wait for permission. So we waited quite a while. And all of a sudden, a body had been carried out, covered in a black cloth, and it was not large enough to cover the whole body, and placed on a trolley in front of us, like on my right side. And I thought myself, I looked at this body and I thought, why they placing this body in front of us? And then I looked at it again, and I recognized they were the feet of my brothers. You see, we were 9 children, 5 brothers and 4 sisters. He was the youngest of the brothers, and I was the youngest of the sisters. And we had so much in common. We always joked together, and he was my favorite brother. So I nudged my mother, and I said, Mom, this is Vilek, his name was. And she says, oh no, Vilek is upstairs, they're operating on him. So I said, no, this is Vilek. Then my sister comes over, and my other one. And they looked at it, and they recognized it was my brother. It was took a lot of persuasion until my mother realized this is her son. And of course, a proper burial wasn't allowed, and he's been wheeled away. And months later, they told us just about where he was buried. So it was a loss of him. A few weeks later, the segregation of women. One of my brothers was married, and he was 7 in the Polish army, and he had a child. So he's been away, and his wife lived in the same building as we were. And in alphabetical order, we had to stand up. You see, the huge place, very large hall, and in front there were about 35 Nazis. And we had to stand, hundreds and hundreds of us. My sister-in-law with that little boy stood in front of us. And she's taking out some sweets, and which she saved. And she wanted to give to my nephew. And he turned round to her. "Mommy, don't worry. If the Germans want to shoot me, he will lay down and he will pretend that he is dead." Now, can you imagine a child of 3.5 years old to turn around to say that to his mother? As we approached this panel of Nazis, they were told to go to the right. My sister-in-law, my nephew. My mother and my two sisters to the left. And they were shouting at us, "Quick, we shall leave." And hundreds of women in front of us. We took quite a while to get out. So as we were waiting, I turned around, and I've seen on that right side so many women and children, and then being taken away. That was the very first transport to Auschwitz. And the rest you can imagine. They were straight into the gas chambers. So the news, how to bring that to my brother, which if ever he will come back from the army. But as it happens, some weeks later, he escaped. They segregated the Jewish soldiers from the Polish soldiers, Christian soldiers, and they've taken him to the wood, and my brother escaped, and he came into the ghetto. And to tell him about what happened to his wife and his child was a very difficult task for us. And of course my mother was rather brave, and she broke into him gently, and he turned around, he says, "He's not going to stay here. He's going to the French resistance, and he's going to fight the Germans." So he managed to obtain some Christian papers. He didn't look very much Jewish. He could easily escape. And a few of his friends. He went down the sewers in a ghetto in order to get out. And the Nazis were waiting outside the other side, and they shot him there and there, and so many others of his colleagues. So when we learned about it, how did we learn it? Because they found some clothes which belonged to him, a waistcoat, and we recognized that it was his. So it was a loss of him. And to a Jew that was rather very difficult to come in terms with those losses. Then they told us the ghetto, the camp is ready, the concentration camp, which is built on the Schindler's List was filmed on that camp, my very first concentration camp, Auschwitz. So they told us that we are only allowed to take with us about 35 kilometers, and we have to move out. So we've taken those belongings. They've taken us to that huge barrack. We weren't allowed to go on buses or trams or trains, nothing. We had to wear Star of David, and we had to just everything on foot. And we were accompanied by station dogs and Ukrainians and Nazis. So we got into that camp. Huge bunks were huge barrack. There were straw mattresses and a blanket. So my mother and a few friends and my two sisters, we kept very close. We found a place on a bunk. In the morning, we had to stand, 5 o'clock in the morning, had to stand to attention to be counted in case someone has escaped. And then they told us we have to march out to that huge square. They called it Appellplatz. Men separate and women separate, regardless they were married. So we went out there, and then we had to wait for Commander Goeth to appear. Actually, the Schindler's List portrayed him rather very slim, But he was a man of enormous height and very heavily built, and he walked like an elephant, always accompanied by station dogs, and sometimes galloped on a horse, a whip in one hand and a gun in the other. So he used to come over to our side, the women's side, looked around, several lashes across our faces. Then he walked over to the men's side, and he looked. You have not shaved today, shot him down. You look too stupid, shot him down. You look too clever, shot him down. In a morning like that, he could have shot 50 to 70 men. And that occurred very, very often. And we were praying, what's going to happen next? And then we had to go on foot again to work into the city, to this factory. And this was everyday casualties. In the meantime, so many transports again, and taken into the mountain and being shot there and there. Segregating, some of them, they were used. For them, you see, they were used to be able to work, so they kept them alive for a little while. And the others, they just machine gunned them there and there. We were able to bring a bit of food. We managed to obtain, by the Polish people, we bought the exchange of a ring or chain or something, or watch, for a loaf of bread, and sometimes for a bit of soup. And we brought it in to the camp. Sometimes we were searched, so we lost everything. And it was the soup, the ration in the barrack was very, very terrible. The soup made out of more water, sago, and a slice of bread in the morning, so on. One day they told us, the barracks, the factory is going to be built in a camp, and no one will be able to get out, with the exception of one group, which my sister, Miriam, she had a boyfriend, and the rabbi performed the ceremony. He was older than he was an architect. He started a building in the center of the city, and he had to finish it. So he had 55 men working for him, and she was acting as his secretary. So they were allowed to go out to work. And we were locked in the camp, the factories. So every day they brought us some food. Sometimes they've been searched, they've been confiscated, but sometimes they managed to bring in. And we shared with those which they did not have enough food. And each one of those men had their own families or relatives, so they used to share with them, which was a great help. And one day my sister comes over, she says, I'm so upset that you're so locked away here, and I think I have got a job for you, which I'll be able to let you know tomorrow. So I was really very happy that I'd be able to go out and help to bring some more food in. Because, you see, the most important commodity was the food, the bread. Everything what you were doing, everything was focused on that, because the starvation was so horrendous. So, tomorrow come, and I walked over to the window. She used to come about 7 o'clock in the evening. And that happened on the 14th of September, 1939. 1942, beg your pardon. And she walked over to the window, and she was waiting. So I was waiting, and I haven't seen anyone coming. And all of a sudden I heard some shots, and said, "Your power just threw me away from the window." And I shook my head, and I said to myself, "What is it?" And I walked towards the window, And I heard more shots and more, and then silence. So I was rather disappointed that she hasn't come yet, but I thought there must be transports, because that was their usual procedure. The transport arrived in the night or during the day. They used to segregate him and shot him there and there. So I walked over to my mother and I said, you know, there must be a delay. That's why she didn't come yet, because there must have been a transport. And we were walking, working, and so on. Then all of a sudden, a group of girls came in. And they were shushing with other girls in the corners. And as I approached them, they stopped talking. Then another group of girls came in. And then I approached them, and they said, so I said, please, could you tell me what happened outside? Oh, they said, no, nothing. But I said, look, what are those shots? Would you please tell me what happened? They said, yes, there were 55 men and one girl. They had to undress and dig their own grave. And then I realized that was my sister amongst them. And to tell that news to my mother was rather very difficult. Then we had to carry wood for the bodies to be burned, because the Germans didn't want to leave any trace. So can you imagine, for a mother to know that this is her child and she's carrying the wood for the bodies to be burned? And as for myself, she always used to sleep on my left side, on my arm. And from that night onwards until today, I always feel such a chill, like something torn away from me. So it was very, very upsetting how to cope with that. The tears we shared that night, we could have filled buckets full of. My other sister, Helen, was working in Schindler's factory on a night shift, and during the day she was kidnapped on the way to her living quarters and taken into the hospital for experiments. They injected her with petrol and drew out her blood. It seems unbelievable to you, but that was true. And the nurse, which I knew very well, when I wanted to see her, I wasn't allowed. And slowly, I lost her as well. So I was left with my mother, which whatever food I could obtain, I gave it to her, because I felt as long as she's not starving, that was sufficient for me. Sometimes I was hungry, but the thought that she's filled, it was sufficient, content. And wherever I could, and always she gave me a lot of courage to go on. Actually, I lived only for her. Sometimes I thought, oh, maybe I throw myself against the wires, because it was enough. But then I thought, how could I? Who will look after my mother? So because of that, I stayed on and looked after her, and wherever I could. We used to march, and the Nazis used to watch us. If people were just walking very slowly or downwards, they used to shoot them there and there. So I used to grab my mother's arm. I said, come and walk straight, let's walk, because they're watching us. Then one day they told us that we have to leave this camp Plaszow, and we weren't allowed to take anything with us on foot as we stood. And we marched for days and days, During the night I used to requisition a village, and we slept outside in stables, wherever. In one village, in the courtyard, there were logs. The farmers, they store them for the winter. And it was rather very high, and the roof above. And so my mother said, you know what, there's no other way. If you will climb up, and you put your feet towards my mouth, and I put my feet to your mouth, so we keep ourselves warm. And so we did climb up. And for a while it was warm, and then we fell asleep from exhaustion. In the middle of the night I woke up. I was like a lump of ice. I just could not move my limbs, my arms, my legs. I could not move. And slowly, slowly I was just maneuvering, just trying to move. And I lift up one leg towards the ground, the snow above my knee, because fallen that night. Then the other. Then I shook my mother, and she did not respond. And I was rather in a panic, and I shook her, and rubbed her feet, and then her face, and gradually she has woken up. The pulse was going, so it's only this. And slowly I lifted downwards. And at that point I felt, it would be so much better if they shoot us. Because the frost and the hunger and the fear and the torture, it was too much to take in. So I've seen a light far away, and I said to my mother, let's walk towards there. And really, truly, I was hoping, don't forget there were guards all around. And I was really hoping they would shoot us. But we walked, and we reached that hut, and they didn't shoot us, whether maybe they were asleep or whatever. We opened this door that was a farmer's house, and we've seen so many of our people were on the floor, on the stairs, everywhere sleeping. They were cleverer than we were. And the farmer's wife came out, and she took us into her room. And she put us in front of an oven, which gave out a tremendous heat. I never forget, it was such a round one, and it was so much glue from the heat. It was wonderful. And she pulled off our boots. They were full of water. And our socks. And she brought some dry socks for us to put on. And gave us some hot coffee and some bread. And it was a wonderful gesture. And I tell you, until today, I always feel I would love to go back to say thank you. But I can't possibly find whereabout it was. So shows you that it was a human gesture. And early hours, again, they were shouting at us, the Nazis, quick, we have to march. And we marched again to villages, to cities, and we found ourselves in Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, we were segregated by Dr. Mengele. As maybe you read about him, he was the one who tortured and experimented on people. And we were segregated to a shower. So many women and my mother and myself. And we walked down and some steps, and we got into that place. Stone floors, openings in the ceiling. We were shivering. We had to leave our clothes behind. And then no soap was given to us. And we were waiting and waiting, trembling. It was bitter cold. And all of a sudden, doors opened on my left, and walked in a woman, which I've recognized she was the clerk working in a previous camp. I stood on my toes, and I thought, oh, I would like to speak to her. And it's so many women in front, it was difficult. And I stood and she says, and she noticed me, she stretched her arms, and she said, you are here. And then she rushed out, and I was rather disappointed I wasn't able to speak to her. But then water came through, and we showered ourselves, and we drank it because we were so thirsty. And we came out of there when the water stopped. The women embraced us who worked there, and they shouted, you are wonderful, you are alive. We thought we never see you again. You came out of the fire. I looked around, I said, what are you talking about? And they were, embracing us. They were so happy to see us. I said, what are you talking about? They said, don't you know where you've been? I said, no, where? You were in a gas chamber. When I heard that, I completely, utterly lost my voice. Nothing came through, no saliva, nothing. And I tell you, took a few minutes until I start speaking. And at that point I felt it must be power over powers, that God must have saved my life. And so many others were with me. I get emotional, which is understandable, I suppose. So, of course, our clothes been taken away. So each one of those women brought a blanket and a tunic and for us to put on. And we walked out on foot again to Birkenau, which is the annex of Auschwitz. And we got in there. There were huge ovens, not on. There were bunks, but no straw mattresses and no blankets. So we found this barrack and the bunk with some friends we kept together, my mother, and we fall asleep. As a matter of fact, one of those barracks, I've recently taken some students to Auschwitz to visit Auschwitz, the universities and so on. I always take him there. So it was my grandson, and this barrack still is in existence. So I showed them that, and I showed them this is the bank. Sorry, where I slept. Actually, I've got a photo my grandson taken. And so I pointed out another college where my other grandson goes to Emmanuel College, and that was the university, Leeds University, the previous one. And I pointed out to him as well. So it's there. We did not stay there long. We marched again on foot through Germany. And we were so thirsty. Absolutely, you can't possibly imagine. We weren't so hungry, but we were so dry. And we were begging for some water. The German people used to come out with buckets of water, but they poured out in front of us in order not to give it to us. So today, when you ask the older generation, German generation, don't you know there were concentration camps and how people were starving? They said no, they don't know. But they knew very well, because they knew what state we were and how much we were gasping for a glass of water. So I always thought myself, is that a human gesture? Is that how people could go to its lowest and not show any mercy and see how people were starving, marching? And so many hundreds of people were shot into the gutter. One can't possibly imagine, in the hundreds. We found ourselves in Leslau, a city in Germany, There were open trucks waiting. And we were so relieved because our legs could not carry us any longer. And so we climbed up. And wherever I could, I always pushed my mother because the Germans did not have patience, you know. If someone couldn't climb or run, they shoot. So I always pushed my mother first. And whatever we could do. And then those people who did not climb up, they've been left behind. The only food was the snow from our shoulders. And they wheeled us again, backwards and forwards, for days and days. Then we found ourselves in Buchenwald. And Buchenwald was the concentration camp mainly for Polish Christian descent. And we were shouted by the Nazis again, out, out. And they gave up their own soup in order to give it to us. And I tell you, that soup tasted so delicious. And I'm quite a good cook, but I can't possibly produce a soup of the taste as tasted that time. So then trains arrived, sealed trains, and out the Nazis jumped out, and they shouting at us that we have to jump up to those. And so many to one compartment, one can't possibly imagine. We were in one position, the knees were towards our chins, and we were like that. You could not move left or right. The scream, the stench, the cry was impossible to describe. And then we fall asleep. We must have slept for days from exhaustion. And then suddenly the train stopped. And the unlocking the locks I can still hear today. We greeted by the Nazis. It was in the middle of the woods. The only reflection was the snow. And they shouting at us, rouse, rouse, out, march, march. And we marched for hours. And we reached Belsen concentration camp. Belsen concentration camp was known to us, the German called Vernichtungslager, finishing camp. From there is no escape. We were told to get into that huge barracks, huge ones. There were openings for windows, but no glass in them. No bunks, no straw mattresses, no blankets, just bare floors. We found a corner, my mother and some of the girls, we kept together, and we fell asleep from exhaustion. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up, and so many people died that night. One can't possibly imagine. And I stood up, and I looked out, and I've seen walking skeletons. In every sense of the word, you could not distinguish they were men or women. There were heaps of bodies outside each barrack. Mountains, you can say. It's impossible how much one would like to portray. You can't comprehend. It was terrible. And I said to myself, I'm not going to die like that. And I woke up my mother and I said, I'll soon be back. And such a power just got into me, and I trod out, and so many peeps through the people even were dead already. And I rushed out, and I was aiming for a hospital. You see, my ambition always was to study in the medical field. So I thought I aimed for the hospital. So I smuggled myself from one barrack to another and asked, where is a hospital? And don't forget, there were guards all around, so you had to be very careful. And eventually I reached a hospital. And I got there and I said, can you use any help? They said, yes. So I was always thinking of, I saw my mother, but she wouldn't be able to do the work. So a friend. So I asked, can you use some more? So he said, yes, you can bring one more friend. And then I had to memorize where that my barrack was. And so I smuggled myself back to the barrack, and I was so pleased that I would be able to go to work. So we tossed who is coming with me. So we got a ration of our bread, which was as large as that, and a bit of soup which we had, which was like water. And then we had that soup in the barrack, and then we marched out to work. I was very lucky before because there was no guards there on the gate between the hospital and the barracks. So as we were approaching this post, there was Irma Krese. She was the one who was in charge of all the SS women. She was the beast of all the concentration camps. And she says, "Halt, Judah, stop, Jew. What have you got there?" I had a little bag with a zip on top. And underneath that lining, I had a picture of my sister, which was shot in a Plaszow. And I treasured that. And I thought, so she snatched that bag, and she tore out the lining. You see, she thought that I've got some treasures there. She was rather disappointed. She didn't realize that we gave up all our possessions in the previous camps. They came in with suitcases into the barrack, and they told us we had to throw in everything what glitters, even a spoon or fork, all our jewelry, everything we had to throw in. My mother sewn in some jewelry in our shoulder pads, and so we thought maybe we're safe. But it wasn't. They told us one day we had to leave our barrack naked, and they've torn all our clothes to pieces and searching for our belongings, for treasures. So she was rather disappointed she didn't find anything. So she looked at that picture and she tore it to tiny bits and gave me several lashes across my face. She says, "Now you can go to work." You see, I didn't care so much about the ration of my bread and the bag, but the picture meant so much to me. So I went into the hospital and working like I would have been a qualified nurse. But I must tell you, whatever I've been doing, it wasn't only me, but I felt there was something with me, something really helped me to go on. Like such a power. And it was amazing how we coped with the patients and the injections I was doing and this and that. And there were also, in the evening, there were 2 slices of bread left over and a bit of soup. But we did it ourselves. We've taken it back to the barrack and we shared with the others. So every day I was very fortunate I was able to bring some food and some medications to the other people. You see, the typhus epidemic, dysentery, all diseases were very rife. And the people were dying like flies, in their hundreds. Reports used to come in 500 people died. 300, we said, thank God, only 300. It was very, very, one can't visualize whatever, how much I portray you. You have to magnify, really, whatever you hear from me. One day I happened to sterilize the instruments, and the table was under the window, and the windows led to the outskirts of the camp. And you see, all the time while you were working, and all the time while you were in the camp, you had to act dumb. You don't see anything, you don't hear anything. You have to focus everything. You have to work. This is your job, and you've got to concentrate on that. So as I was sterilizing the instruments, I lift up my head, and I've seen tanks passing by, and loads of tanks, and with a star, and I couldn't distinguish what nationality they were, but I thought there must be, the requisitioned, because it was their usual way. And then walked in the wife of the commandant Kramer of Belsen. Joseph Kramer was the commandant of Belsen concentration camp. And she walked in with Dr. Klein, and he was another one who experimented on people. And they were conversing in German, which I understood, and I'm just concentrate on my work. And she turned around to him, she says, my husband went to meet him, and they should be very shortly here. And then they walked over to the window, and they were looking, and then walked in a couple, a German descent. She was in charge of Polish prisoners. And she wanted to be nice to Mrs. Kramer, so, schmooze up to her. So she said, put on her hips, her hands on her hips, and she says, I never thought that the British troops will enter the German soil. So to my mind came in a boy. While we were queuing for the soup in Buchenwald, this Polish boy walked by and he whispered in Polish, the war is coming to an end, heads up. I didn't take much notice then because I thought maybe he wants to give us some more courage to go on. So I've put the two together and I thought maybe this is it. And happened everything very quickly. The gates opened and tanks and jeeps and loudspeakers voice came through. We British, we came to liberate you in all languages. The Nazis, the Germans got nothing more to say to you. Be happy. So of course the tears of joy poured down my cheeks, but I quickly wiped them away because I could have been shot if the Germans saw it. And then some officers, British officers, came to the foot of the hospital. And I gave them to wash some water, some washed their hands, they were full of mud, and they were still escorted by the Germans, and the Germans were still armed, which I could not understand why they have not yet been disarmed. But that wasn't for very long. The British Intelligence Corps, that same day, they've told the Germans they have to assemble outside their headquarters, and they've been then taken prisoner. And they disarmed them, and amongst them there were some Jewish soldiers. And then also at the same time, about an hour later, 2 hours later, 2 officers came into the hospital. And I happened to be in a different ward, and the nurse, who was Polish, she couldn't understand any other languages. She called me out. She says, there are 2 British officers, and I don't understand what they want. So I came out, and so they asked me, do I speak English? I said, I'm afraid not, but do you speak any other languages? They had to speak French and German. So they said, we asked the questions, such a tone, but in the joking, I suppose. So we conversed in German. So they asked me why I look so clean and the people are so terrible state and so on. So I told them that I'm here nurse, and I've got facilities to wash where there was no water. And the people, they were dying like flies. I tell you, I must emphasize all the time because it was impossible. to describe, and so I told him that we need medication and people dying and so on. And I've taken him around the hospital, and there were so many uniforms left by the Germans. They've changed into civilian clothes, and they escaped to the woods. And in the woods, there were the Dutch resistance waiting. And so some of them, the Germans, been strung up there and there. And some of them, they managed to escape to where now and again they're in the world somewhere, been arrested. But a lot of them escaped. And then they installed water, and it was wonderful, the British troops, the way they brought in the food and the Red Cross. And also where some Americans, Canadians came in afterwards, several weeks later. And it was really a great help, and slowly to civilization. You see, in order to get rid of this epidemic, they had to burn the wooden barracks. So one day they told us that we're going to move into brick barracks, and all those wooden ones be burned down because they're full of insects. So they told us we're moving out of the wooden barracks and to the brick barracks where they were previously occupied by the Russian prisoners. And as the war came to end, they've been sent back. And so we towards civilization. And it was wonderful because, it's a different life approaching. But in the meantime, while we were still trying to save people's lives, one of those two officers was rather very, very interested and used to come in with his translator, happened to be a woman, and I shall tell him what medications we need and so on. He happened to be Jewish, and so every day I had to report what we need and this and that. And one day he turned around, he says, we've been observing you, my commander officer, you've been working day and night, and you are invited to the officers' mess for dinner. And I was rather astonished because I thought, well, I lived such a sheltered life. I was a young girl when the war broke out, and I just couldn't, I was terrified, a stranger. So I asked my mother. My mother was taken ill as well, and I injected her 3 times a day in order not to have guilty conscience that I haven't done enough, and using my own common sense. But she did recover slowly. So I asked her, what do you think, should I go to that dinner? So she says, well, maybe you take your friend with you, which I did, and we had to be disinfected because no civilians were allowed to leave the camp. And then the troops, the British, when they arrived in the morning, they had to be disinfected, and in the evening when they left, not to carry the epidemic out of the camp. So we had this treatment. We got into this officers' mess, was several kilometers outside the camp, and we opened the door to this, and I've seen beautifully decorated tables with white tablecloths and flowers, which I haven't seen for so many years, 6 years. So I turned round to the Sergeant Norman. I said, do you expect any special visitors? What am I doing here? And I just stepped back. So he says, you are the special visitor. This is our engagement party. I said, pardon? I said, maybe anti-influenza of drinks. So we walked in, and his commander officer comes over. He offers me a drink and congratulating me. And then all his colleagues come over, and so many of them congratulating me. And I looked around, and I thought myself, they must be crazy, because I don't know the man. But he was a man, he made up his mind when he first saw me, when he entered Belsen into the camp, into this hospital, that this is the girl he's going to marry. Never mind me what I thought, but he made up his mind. He was a very determined and very stubborn and very determined that this is going to be the way he wants. So, as I mentioned, I didn't want to spoil the evening, and so I thought I'd let him get away with it. Afterwards, after dinner, they've taken us back to our barrack. Off they went. And following day, he's coming over again with this woman translator. He walks over, he wanted to give me a kiss. And I pushed him away, because I thought I may have a baby, and I was so terrified. So he says, "What's the matter? You are my fiancé." I said, "Look, you don't know me, and I don't know you. You were born in England, and I was born in Poland. We come from different way of life and different culture." But he did not take for an answer, determination again. And he types out the official paper that I'm engaged to a British sergeant. I have to wait for his return to get married. And he also left a ring with me. Why did he do that? Because his unit had to move on further into Germany, searching for other Nazis. So to assure himself that I will be there for him, that's why he's done that. And of course he went. And I was left with this paper and that ring, which I completely ignored, with the influx of people from all over Europe, from other camps, they're all searching for their loved ones. Some of them, they were lucky, some of them not. They're searching for their mothers or fathers or brothers or sisters, sons, husbands. And so it was so much to do, and people were seeking help, medical help, and people were dying and dying. It was terrible. As I mentioned, we moved into the brick barracks, and for several weeks after, towards, shall we say, September, all of a sudden my mother called me up. I shared a room with two girls, my mother and I. And my mother called me out. I was outside the building. And I thought, oh, in the tone she just kept, "Come on, quickly." I thought maybe she had a relapse, you see. But I rushed up. And I've opened the door. And from behind the curtains, which we used as a washroom, because we did not have yet the luxury of a bathroom, walked out Norman in his uniform, and he raised his hand. He says, "Sorry I couldn't come sooner, because he had to go back to England. His mother had a heart attack, but now she's better, and he's got only 2 hours leave. And he especially came to see me to establish a day of our marriage. And please don't say no." And of course his persuasion, his determination rose again, and explained it to me and this and that. And I gave in. And we established a day of our marriage for the 7th of October. And Norman's friend brought in a British parachute, and my dress was made out of British parachute, which is now in the Imperial War Museum on show by request. And it's amazing, because Her Majesty Queen opened this exhibition, Women at War, and my dress was exhibited, and I was introduced to her that I was the one who wore the dress. And she says, "Oh yes, your dress brought wonderful finish to the whole exhibition." And it was wonderful, and it was such a wonderful achievement in a way. And then, as a British subject, I wasn't allowed to stay in Germany, so no one was given compassion leave to take me to England. And my very first step was where my in-laws lived, northwest London. And the reporters got hold of me, and I shall write stories, and it was emotional strain, it was considerable. I adopted 3 ambitions: to learn the way of British life, and to learn the English language, and to write about my memoirs in case I forget. But how can one forget those atrocities? So I've written pages and pages. So I've written this book, I Light a Candle, for the people who haven't got a clue what went on, and for generations to come, and should never, never allow to happen again. I have received the MB by Her Majesty the Queen for the work which I do. I lecture at universities, colleges, schools, learn, teach him, I'm given lessons about the Holocaust. They should never be forgotten, and they should never forget, and teach their own children and children to come. And of course it's very rewarding for me, because enormous amount of letters. I've got boxes full of letters from the children, how much I hope them and how much they appreciate their life now. The feedback is tremendous, which gives me a lot of comfort. And I feel it is my duty, as long as I can, to broaden the people's horizon and to learn about it. And the Holocaust Day should be always observed. So as long as I can, and I do hope they will light a candle long after me.